Whispers of History.
The year was 1837, and Georgia was a land caught between superstition and survival. The soil was rich, yet the people lived in quiet unease, burdened by debt, whispers of witchcraft, and the looming specter of poverty. It was in this uneasy soil that the story of the fortune teller first took root. She was not the kind of woman who lived in the open light of day. She moved on the edges of towns, her voice a low murmur in taverns, her presence marked by a shawl drawn close and eyes that seemed to linger too long. To some, she was a healer, a guide who could glimpse the future. To others, she was a predator hiding behind a veil of mysticism. Imagine the scene: a dirt road winding through the pine forests of Georgia, the evening air heavy with the scent of resin and damp leaves. A weary traveler halts as a voice calls from the shadows. A woman dressed in faded garments steps forward and offers a reading. Her words are honey, threaded with menace. "Your path is cursed," she whispers, "but I can show you the way out." Many who heard her promises believed she could hold back death itself. Yet the irony was bitter. For those who placed their faith in her, death was often the very destination they found. Her victims were not chosen at random. They were the vulnerable, farmers weighed down by failing crops, widows desperate for comfort, men who had squandered fortunes and sought redemption in her promises. She studied them carefully, watched their eyes flicker when she spoke of wealth or tremble when she spoke of sickness. She knew exactly which thread of fear or hope to tug until they were caught in her snare. And once they followed her, deep into the quiet woods or behind the door of a dimly lit cabin, they rarely returned. But what made her so convincing? What allowed her to lure people again and again with nothing but words? To understand this, we must remember the world of the 1830s. In rural Georgia, religion was strong, but so were the remnants of folk beliefs brought by immigrants, slaves, and the isolated poor. The Bible and superstition lived side by side. A sermon on Sunday might be followed by a whispered charm on Monday. People feared the devil, yet also feared curses, omens, and the restless dead. In that strange overlap between faith and fear, the fortune teller thrived. The local newspapers would later describe her as a figure of unnatural persuasion, a woman whose very presence seemed to bend the will of those around her. Survivors, few though they were, spoke of being entranced, unable to resist her command. She might ask a man to walk with her into the swamp at night, and he would obey without hesitation. She might tell a woman to drink a bitter potion, and the woman would swallow it with trembling lips. These details, however, came later, when the story was already steeped in blood and whispers. At the beginning, she was only a curiosity, a fortune teller whose predictions often ended in tragedy. The first known case was whispered about in hushed tones, a merchant traveling from Savannah to the upland towns. He was seen one evening speaking with her at the roadside. By dawn, his horse returned alone, reins dragging in the mud. His body, some claimed, was never found. Others whispered it had been buried beneath the black water of the swamp. There was no proof, only rumor. Yet those rumors grew heavier with each disappearance. A widow vanished. A young couple was said to have followed her into the forest and were never seen again. Soon, the tally of the missing stretched beyond coincidence, and so the legend of the fortune teller began to spread. Some called her a witch. Others claimed she was possessed. A few even argued she was a con artist using fear as her weapon. But all agreed on one thing. To look into her eyes was to feel the slow pull of something you could not explain, something that left you both terrified and compelled. She did not chase her victims. She invited them quietly, calmly, as though death itself was nothing more than an appointment to be kept. Tonight, we step back into that shadowed world of 1837 Georgia. We walk the dirt roads where pine needles crunch underfoot, where lamps burn dim in small farmhouses, and where a woman's voice promised salvation, but delivered something far darker. Who was she? A fraud, a murderer, or a figure shaped by the fears of her time? And why did so many follow her when they must have sensed the danger that lay ahead? This is the story of the fortune teller who lured victims to their death, a tale of belief, fear, and the human hunger for answers, no matter how dangerous the source. To understand how a fortune teller could rise to such a strange and terrible prominence in 1837 Georgia, we must first step into the world she inhabited. It was a landscape defined by contradictions. On one hand, there was immense wealth, drawn from cotton fields tilled by enslaved labor. On the other, there was deep poverty, a class of small farmers and itinerant workers scraping out a living on rocky soil. The state was young, restless, and perpetually shifting. Expansion was the promise, but instability was the reality. The 1830s were marked by turbulence across the United States. The nation was still reeling from Andrew Jackson's presidency, his fierce populism, and his policy of Indian removal. In Georgia, this meant displacement on a massive scale. The Cherokee and Creek, who had long lived on the fertile lands of northern and central Georgia, were being driven westward under the Indian Removal Act. Their villages were emptied, their farms abandoned, and their people forced into the long, cruel march that would become known as the Trail of Tears. The newly available land was parceled out through lotteries, given to settlers eager to claim their fortune. But fortune, more often than not, proved elusive. The land may have been fertile, but it required labor, and labor required capital. Many new settlers did not have the means to work vast tracts of farmland, and debts quickly mounted. The Panic of 1837, a financial collapse that spread across the United States, struck Georgia particularly hard. Banks failed, credit vanished, and families who had pinned their hopes on new farms or businesses suddenly found themselves ruined. It was in this desperate environment that fear and superstition thrived. Religion was the cornerstone of daily life, but it was not always enough to soothe restless minds. Protestant revivals swept through the South, filling tent meetings with fiery sermons about damnation and salvation. Yet at the same time, older traditions endured: folk remedies, charms against sickness, whispered spells to ward off bad luck. Enslaved Africans brought with them beliefs that blended with European folklore, creating a unique patchwork of Southern superstition. People carried Bible verses in their pockets, but they also nailed horseshoes above their doors, fearing the evil eye as much as the devil himself. This was the world of the fortune teller. She was not unique in her craft. Across Georgia and the wider South, there were cunning women, root doctors, and self-styled seers who promised to heal ailments, locate lost objects, or reveal the future. Most operated harmlessly, their influence confined to small circles of the poor and desperate. But what set our subject apart was her sinister reputation for vanishing clients. She was not merely a curiosity on the margins, she became a figure of whispered dread. Life in rural Georgia could be brutally isolating. Communities were scattered, connected by dirt tracks rather than bustling roads. A farmer might live miles from his nearest neighbor, and the swampy wilderness swallowed those who strayed too far. In such isolation, rumors carried a peculiar weight. A single disappearance could be dismissed as accident. 2 or 3 could be explained by bandits or the hazards of travel. But when patterns began to emerge, when multiple people were last seen with the same woman, suspicion thickened into legend. The newspapers of the era tell us something about this atmosphere. The Macon Messenger and the Milledgeville Recorder often printed tales of crime, witchcraft, and unexplained deaths. Supernatural explanations were rarely offered directly, but the language of their reporting carried heavy suggestion. They described mysterious women, unnatural persuasions, and dark arts, blending crime reporting with Gothic insinuation. Such language reflected the public mood. People lived in fear of things they could not control, and they sought meaning in stories that blurred the line between fact and folklore. Georgia in 1837 was also a place of violence. Dueling still occurred among the elite. Public hangings were communal spectacles. Slave patrols roamed the countryside at night, wielding whips and guns to enforce a brutal order. Death was never far from sight. It lingered in the fields, in the diseases that swept through cabins, and in the frequent accidents of frontier life. The fortune teller's presence fed into this environment. To some, she seemed merely another expression of death's inevitability, a shadowy figure who merely hastened what was already near. To others, she was a force of evil incarnate, exploiting grief and hunger for her own gain, and yet, paradoxically, the very people who feared her were often the ones who sought her out. A farmer whose crop had failed might ignore the preacher's warnings and visit her cabin in secret, hoping for a charm to bring rain. A woman whose child was sick might risk gossip to ask for her remedies. Even the educated were not immune. Judges, merchants, and politicians privately consulted fortune tellers while publicly denouncing them. This hypocrisy only deepened the sense of unease. If even men of learning could be swayed, what power did she truly hold? It is worth noting, too, the gendered aspect of her influence. Women in 1830s Georgia held limited power. They could not vote, had few legal rights, and were largely confined to the domestic sphere. Yet women who embraced roles as healers or seers could carve out a unique authority. They could intimidate men, shape decisions, and in some cases, wield real control over the lives of others. The fortune teller of 1837 embodied this paradox. She was both marginal and central, dismissed as a charlatan by the powerful, yet secretly feared and respected. As we reflect on the broader cultural context, one truth becomes clear: the fortune teller was not an anomaly. She was a product of her time, a figure born from social instability, economic collapse, cultural mixing, and the human desire to control the uncontrollable. But while many fortune tellers remained obscure footnotes in local memory, she became something else. She crossed the line from curiosity to terror, from whispered rumor to documented dread. Her story cannot be fully separated from the anxieties of 1837 Georgia. The land itself was in flux, reshaped by forced removal, economic ruin, and social upheaval. People lived on uncertain ground, literally and metaphorically. The fortune teller did not create this uncertainty, but she exploited it. She was a mirror held up to a society trembling on the edge, reflecting both its hunger for hope and its vulnerability to fear. And in that reflection, lives were lost. This is the backdrop against which the tale unfolds. A fragile society, haunted by both faith and superstition, a landscape of poverty, ambition, and despair. And in the center of it all, a woman whose voice could coax the weary and desperate to follow her, even when the path led only into darkness. The first reports were small, almost whispers. A traveling peddler, known for selling trinkets and ribbons at farmsteads along the Oconee River, was said to have vanished after stopping at the fortune teller's cabin. He had been seen walking with her in the twilight, his pack heavy with unsold goods, his smile weary but eager. Days later, when his mule wandered back to the settlement without its owner, people began to murmur. Some assumed bandits had waylaid him. Others suggested he had simply moved on, leaving behind a life of struggle. But the timing lingered in the minds of neighbors. He had gone to see her, and he had never returned. Soon after came the story of a farmer's daughter, barely 17, who sought her help in secret. She had fallen in love with a man her family disapproved of, and in desperation, she asked the fortune teller to cast a charm that might bend fate to her desires. The girl was last seen walking into the swamp path near dusk, carrying a small basket of eggs, payment perhaps for the service. She never returned home. The family searched, calling her name into the black water and tangled cypress. Only the echo of frogs and insects answered. In their grief, they whispered the unthinkable, that she had been taken, not by accident, but by design. These disappearances were unsettling, but in Georgia of 1837, loss was not unusual. Men drowned while fording rivers, children succumbed to fever, women vanished in childbirth. Life was fragile and death always near. Yet as the months passed, the pattern grew harder to ignore. Each absence, when traced back, seemed to brush against the same figure. The fortune teller who lived alone, her shack hidden where the land turned marshy and treacherous. She became less a woman in the eyes of neighbors and more a symbol of unease, a dark presence around which fate itself seemed to coil. The fortune teller herself, when confronted, offered cryptic answers. To a neighbor who asked about the vanished girl, she's said to have smiled faintly and replied, "Some paths are not meant to be followed twice." To another who pressed her about the missing peddler, she remarked, "The swamp keeps what it is owed." These phrases, half poetic and half threatening, spread quickly through the settlement. They fed into the legend that was already forming, giving her an aura of both danger and inevitability. Then came the case of Elijah Brooks, a man whose disappearance could not be ignored. Brooks was not a wanderer or an impressionable youth. He was a landowner, respected and cautious, with a reputation for practicality. He had scoffed at talk of charms and spells, calling them nonsense for children. Yet after the collapse of his cotton harvest during the economic panic, desperation drove him to seek answers beyond reason. One evening, he was seen approaching the fortune teller's cabin. The next morning, his horse was found tethered near the swamp, reins dangling. but there was no sign of Brooks himself. Search parties combed the area, but the swamp yielded nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed whole. This incident marked a turning point. When a poor laborer vanished, sympathy was thin. When a merchant's daughter disappeared, suspicion simmered but did not boil. But when a man of status like Elijah Brooks was lost, the whispers hardened into fear. Families warned their children never to stray near the cabin. Men muttered about confronting the fortune teller directly, though few dared to approach her door. Rumors swelled. Some claimed to hear cries at night drifting from the swamp, faint and strangled, as if the dead themselves were calling. Others swore they had seen shapes moving near her cabin, figures pale and gaunt, lingering at the edge of torchlight before melting into the reeds. One of the most chilling accounts came from a freedman named Jonah, who worked as a guide for hunters in the area. Jonah told of stumbling upon the fortune teller late one evening as he followed a wounded deer into the swamp. He claimed he saw her by firelight, not alone, but surrounded by those who should have been gone. He described faces pale as wax, eyes vacant, standing silently in a circle while she muttered words he could not understand. Jonah fled, and though he lived to tell the tale, he refused ever to set foot near that place again. His story, though unverifiable, spread like wildfire, reinforcing the belief that something unnatural was unfolding. The law, in theory, should have intervened. But Georgia in the 1830s was a place where law was fragile, especially in remote settlements. Sheriffs were few and their authority limited. Without bodies, without evidence, what crime could be charged? The fortune teller was whispered about, but never formally accused. Instead, her power grew in the shadows. The more she was feared, the more people paradoxically sought her out. Farmers ruined by debt, mothers desperate to protect their children, men yearning for love or wealth, all walked the swamp path despite the risks. Some returned, clutching charms or muttering about strange visions. Others did not return at all. A chilling detail surfaced years later, preserved in the recollections of an old settler. He claimed that those who had visited her cabin and survived often came back changed. One man stopped speaking altogether, sitting on his porch for hours, staring into the woods. A woman was said to have fallen into trances, muttering the fortune teller's words under her breath until she wasted away. Another began wandering at night, barefoot and dazed, found once in the swamp with mud up to his waist, whispering that she is waiting. These were not confirmed cases, but they fit too neatly with the larger story, adding layers of dread to the fortune teller's legend. The disappearances continued, and soon the community began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Some argued that the fortune teller was merely a scapegoat, that the swamp itself was the true culprit, a labyrinth of quicksand, snakes, and hidden currents. Others insisted that evil had taken root in her, that she was more than human, perhaps something ancient that had worn the mask of a woman. Pastors thundered from pulpits, warning against the dangers of consorting with dark powers. Yet their sermons did little to stop the curious or the desperate from seeking her out. The paradox held, fear and attraction entwined, tightening the noose around the community's conscience. The final straw, according to local memory, was the disappearance of two brothers, James and William Carter. They had been skeptical, even mocking, of the fortune teller's reputation. One evening, emboldened by drink, they wagered that they could confront her, demand proof of her powers, and return unharmed. They never did. Their bodies were never found. The search was long and bitter, families wading waist-deep into the swamp, lanterns swinging, calling out into the darkness. Nothing answered but the croak of frogs and the buzz of insects. The fortune teller's cabin, when approached, was empty. Fire cold, door ajar, as if she had known they were coming and fled before them. In the months that followed, the cabin itself fell silent. Some said she abandoned it, slipping away into the wilderness to escape suspicion. Others claimed she was still there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek her out. The swamp reclaimed the clearing, vines curling over the roof, water rising around the steps. But the memory lingered. Travelers who passed the place reported an uncanny stillness, as if the air itself refused to move. The incidents, taken together, created a tapestry of dread. Individually, each could be explained away. Bandits, accidents, illness, misadventure. But woven into a whole, they formed a pattern too dark to ignore. People had gone to her, and they had not returned. And in the silence that followed, the line between history and legend blurred until they were indistinguishable. The aftermath of the disappearances rippled far beyond the swamp. Families who had lost loved ones carried their grief like a wound that refused to heal. But grief was not the only burden. They carried suspicion. Around kitchen tables and in church pews, the fortune teller's name was whispered, never spoken too loudly, as if to say it aloud might invite her attention. Mothers warned children not to wander near the wetlands, and fathers made the sign of the cross when passing the road that led to her cabin. Yet silence also reigned, for in a small community bound together by hardship, fear often twisted itself into complicity. Relatives of the missing were divided in their interpretations. Some believed wholeheartedly that the fortune teller had ensnared their kin through trickery or charm, leading them to their deaths. Others argued that the swamp itself had claimed them, that it was easier to imagine a single human culprit than to accept the random cruelty of nature. The swamp in Georgia was merciless. Snakes, gators, and unseen sinkholes made every step perilous. To some, it was not witchcraft but bad luck. Still, the uncanny alignment of disappearances with her cabin cast too long a shadow for coincidence alone. Pastors took the strongest stance. In sermons that rang through clapboard churches, they denounced her as an agent of darkness. "Beware the false prophetess," one minister thundered, "for she cloaks herself in the guise of wisdom but leads only to the grave." Congregations sat in tense silence, their faces reflecting both dread and fascination. Many already believed the devil lurked in swamps and forests, places where the civilized world thinned and the wilderness reigned. The fortune teller, in their eyes, was a living embodiment of that boundary, half woman, half symbol of untamed, dangerous nature. The pulpit gave moral certainty to what the people already felt in their bones. Doctors and men of science offered their own interpretations. Though in 1837 medicine itself was shadowed by superstition, some speculated that the victims had suffered from swamp fever, a term often used for malaria or yellow fever, contracted during visits to her isolated cabin. Others suggested hysteria or mental affliction, particularly in the case of women who vanished. But these explanations rang hollow. How could so many unrelated cases, spread across months and years, all circle back to one figure? Medicine in rural Georgia lacked the tools to probe deeper, and in the absence of certainty, fear once again filled the void. Neighbors, meanwhile, lived in uneasy contradiction. On one hand, they avoided her. They whispered warnings, crossed the road when they saw her approach, and locked their doors earlier at night. On the other hand, some continued to seek her counsel, driven by desperation. In a time of crop failure, epidemic, and economic panic, the lure of someone who claimed to see beyond the veil of fate was too strong. There are accounts, fragmentary, remembered only in family diaries, of farmers sneaking to her cabin under cover of darkness, hoping for a charm against debt, or wives seeking blessings for a safe birth. The same people who condemned her in public sometimes depended on her in secret. This hypocrisy deepened the unease, as if everyone knew they were complicit in keeping her legend alive. The local press, though limited, eventually took notice. In small-town gazettes, odd paragraphs appeared. Another disappearance reported near the Oconee Swamp. Residents fearful. Rumors abound of unnatural influences. These brief notes rarely named her outright, but the implication was clear. Such reports added fuel to the fire. Once written down, the stories hardened into history, and what might have remained whispers became recorded fact. To read of vanishings in print gave them legitimacy. For those already afraid, the newspaper confirmed their darkest suspicions. For skeptics, it offered a challenge that could not be ignored. Fear found expression in ritual. Some families left offerings of bread or salt at crossroads near the swamp, hoping to appease whatever forces resided there. Others kept charms of iron or silver in their homes, convinced that such objects could ward off evil. These practices revealed a cultural truth. Beneath the surface of Christian faith, many in rural Georgia still carried remnants of older folk beliefs, traditions that blurred the line between prayer and superstition. The fortune teller thrived in that blurred space, embodying both fear and fascination, damnation and hope. Psychologically, the community bore the marks of collective trauma. Each new disappearance reopened the wound of the last, reinforcing a cycle of anxiety. Gossip became a form of coping, turning tragedy into narrative, something that could be shared, repeated, reshaped. To speak of her powers gave structure to the chaos, even if that structure was dark. In this way, the fortune teller became less an individual and more an idea, an explanation for the inexplicable, a vessel for the community's dread. What makes the reaction so striking is its duality. People wanted her gone, yet they could not let her go. They feared her cabin, yet some sought it out. They condemned her, yet in whispers they admitted that perhaps she did indeed possess knowledge beyond their reach. In this tension, the community revealed its own fracture between faith and doubt, reason and superstition, fear and desire. It was not only the missing who were haunted, but the living themselves, trapped between condemnation and complicity. By the late 1830s, the reaction had become almost ritualized. When someone disappeared, suspicion immediately turned to the swamp. When an ill omen struck, a failed crop, a stillborn child, the fortune teller's shadow loomed. She had become a lens through which every misfortune was interpreted. In this way, her legend expanded beyond the facts of who she was or what she did. The community itself wove her into its fabric of fear, ensuring that long after her cabin rotted away, her name would endure in whispers and warnings. In the end, the societal response tells us as much about the people as about the woman herself. In a place of uncertainty, where death was common and justice elusive, fear became a kind of anchor. By pointing to her, the community found a way to explain tragedy, to contain chaos within the shape of a single figure. But in doing so, they also gave her power she might never have truly possessed. She lived in their fear, and in their fear she became immortal. The autumn of 1837 descended upon the Georgian hills with a strange stillness. Leaves turned brittle and red, yet the air remained unnaturally heavy, as though the forest itself held its breath. Celeste, the fortune teller whose whispered prophecies had already hollowed out so many lives, began to draw people once again toward her dimly lit cabin. By then, the community's fear had hardened into obsession. Each household, each family, seemed to carry a story of someone who had gone to her in desperation, only to meet a fate too perfectly aligned with her foretelling. And yet still they came, hungry for guidance, drawn like moths to a flame that promised light but delivered only ash. It was during this uneasy season that the most dramatic and terrible sequence of events unfolded, searing her legend permanently into the memory of the region. The story begins with Jonathan Price, a prosperous planter whose land spread across the river valley. He was a man skeptical of superstition, one who dismissed Celeste as a manipulator of gullible minds. But when his eldest daughter fell gravely ill with a fever that doctors could neither explain nor cure, skepticism faltered. Neighbors whispered that only Celeste might know whether she would live or die. Against his better judgment, Price rode into the woods on a moonless night. Accounts of what happened differ, but all agree on one detail. When Price returned, he was a broken man. His eyes were wide, his voice unsteady. He told no one exactly what Celeste had said, only that she had shown him the shape of what awaited. Days later, his daughter passed away, and Price himself vanished. His body was never recovered, though his horse was found wandering near the swamp, reins dragging in the mud. Some whispered that grief had driven him to the same fate he had sought to resist. Others believed Celeste had claimed him as part of a bargain too dark to name. The Price tragedy might have been enough to cement her story forever, but it was only the beginning of the storm. In the weeks that followed, 3 more deaths were tied to her words. A young seamstress, Mary Whitford, was said to have been told she would be swallowed by shadows. That very night, she failed to return from a neighbor's home, and at dawn her body was found at the base of a ravine. A farmer's boy, warned he would burn before the harvest was done, died in a fire that consumed his family's barn. And an old widow, desperate to know if she would find peace, collapsed at her own hearth only hours after Celeste assured her she would soon rest in warmth. Each of these deaths rattled the community, binding her legend tighter, like cords around a struggling form. The sense of inevitability, the dread that once spoken, her words became law, began to seep into the marrow of the town. Even those who had never crossed her path began to feel her presence. Every sudden illness, every accident, every unexplained death was laid at her feet. Fear became a contagion, spreading through church pews and marketplaces, through whispered tales by firelight. By November, the collective terror erupted into open action. A group of townsmen, led by Reverend Samuel Turner, declared that Celeste's reign of dread must end. They armed themselves with lanterns, axes, and muskets and set out toward her dwelling. They called it an act of justice, but those who remembered described the march as less a crusade and more a mob, driven by panic rather than law. The night of confrontation was chronicled in the Savannah Gazette weeks later, though the article softened details that survivors later recounted in hushed tones. The men reached Celeste's cabin just past midnight. A mist clung to the ground and the forest groaned with an unnatural stillness. As the first axe struck her door, witnesses swore they heard a shriek, not from Celeste, but from the trees themselves, a sound like the wind crying through hollow bones. Inside, Celeste was waiting. She did not beg or flee. She sat calmly by a dying fire, her eyes reflecting the lantern light in a way that chilled every man present. Turner demanded she renounce her practices, swear before God that she would never again curse or foretell. She only smiled, her lips barely parting, and told them, "You cannot silence what is already written." The confrontation unraveled into chaos. Some of the men lunged to seize her, but their lanterns were knocked over, igniting straw and dry wood. Flames licked at the walls, filling the room with choking smoke. Amid the confusion, Celeste remained seated, unmoving, her voice cutting through the crackle of fire. "Each of you will return to me one by one." Panic gripped the mob. Some fled into the forest, others tried to drag her from the inferno. Yet when the cabin collapsed, no body was recovered. What followed in the weeks after became the true climax of her story. Of the 12 men who entered the woods that night, 6 were dead before spring. One drowned in the river, though he was known to be a strong swimmer. Another was found frozen in his field despite mild weather. A third took his own life, leaving behind a note that mentioned eyes that watched me in every shadow. The others succumbed to accidents that, while plausible, seemed far too coincidental to dismiss. Each death was said to mirror the curse she had uttered in the cabin, that they would return to her. The surviving townsmen carried their terror like a brand. They spoke little, but their silence screamed louder than any testimony. The reverend, who had once preached her as a devil, retreated into seclusion, refusing to stand at the pulpit again. When pressed, he muttered only that she had not been destroyed, only transformed, burned into the very air we breathe. By the following summer, the site of Celeste's cabin had grown over with ivy and weeds, but locals avoided it entirely. Travelers who passed by swore they saw a figure standing among the ruins, pale and unmoving, watching from the shadows. Others reported hearing whispers in the wind, words indistinct but heavy with menace. This was the climax, the moment when myth and reality fused inseparably. Celeste had ceased to be a woman of flesh and blood. She had become something larger, something elemental, a force embodied in every accident, every death, every whispered fear. Her disappearance in the fire had not erased her but elevated her, and the community, bound by dread, could never again disentangle her story from their own. The terror she inspired was not confined to that year, or even that generation. Families carried the tale like an inheritance, passing it down with warnings. Never seek to know too much, never step too deep into the woods, and never listen when the shadows call you by name. For in their hearts they believed she was still waiting, her prophecies echoing not from lips of flesh but from the silence of the trees, and so the climax was not an ending at all. It was the moment of transformation, when Celeste's power shifted from person to legend, when the fear of her became eternal. The story of Celeste, the fortune teller of Georgia in 1837, never truly ended. Her cabin burned, her body vanished, and her name dissolved into folklore, but her presence lingered like smoke clinging to the rafters of memory. For generations after, families in that region continued to speak her name in hushed tones, as if uttering it too loudly might summon her back. In their silence was both fear and reverence, as though she embodied something older than any one life, a reminder that human beings will always yearn for knowledge of the future, even if it destroys them. The families of those men who marched on her cabin bore the heaviest weight. Widows told their children not to walk near the river at night, not because of thieves or animals, but because the shadows still carried debts. Descendants of the Price family refused to speak of Jonathan, the father who had gone into the woods and never returned. His name was erased from family Bibles, as though by blotting him out they might sever the chain of tragedy. But even silence is a form of testimony, and in their omissions, the legend of Celeste grew stronger. The newspapers that once reported the events as curiosities moved on to newer scandals and tragedies. Yet among scholars, the case remained troubling. In the early 20th century, folklorists from the University of Georgia collected oral histories in the region. Time and again, they found the same core of the story intact: a woman who could speak futures into being, a mob who sought to end her reign, and a fire that birthed not closure but transformation. One researcher described the tale as an intersection of fear, gender, and belief in a frontier society teetering between superstition and modern rationalism. From a cultural standpoint, Celeste's story reveals the power imbalance faced by women of the time. Women who practiced healing, herbalism, or divination were often marginalized, cast out, or branded as witches. Some historians suggest Celeste might have been a skilled observer, reading subtle signs of illness or personal strife and weaving them into convincing prophecies. Others argue she deliberately manipulated fear for power and survival. Yet whether she was healer or deceiver, victim or predator, her memory became inseparable from the uncanny. Modern psychology adds another layer of interpretation. The so-called curse she placed upon men who confronted her can be read as a case of suggestion magnified by mass hysteria. The human mind, primed to expect doom, can spiral into fatal accidents, breakdowns, even death. Some of the tragedies that followed the fire may well have been coincidences, but under the weight of belief, coincidence becomes evidence, and evidence becomes myth. Fear itself is often the deadliest weapon, and yet, for all the rational explanations, something remains unsettled. Visitors to the old site of her cabin, now swallowed by forest, report unease. Hunters have claimed to see a pale woman standing among the trees, vanishing when approached. Travelers along the river sometimes hear a woman's voice calling softly in the mist, though no figure is ever seen. Even skeptics who laugh at the legend admit that the woods there feel wrong, as if carrying a memory carved into the very soil. The epilogue of Celeste's story, then, is not an ending, but a haunting. It is the realization that some figures in history do not remain neatly buried. They seep into culture, shaping the way people think about fate, fear, and forbidden knowledge. Celeste, whether she was an ordinary woman or something far stranger, has survived because she represents the tension at the heart of human existence, the hunger to know what lies ahead, and the terror of what might be revealed. Even today, in Georgia, fragments of her tale appear in local ghost tours, in folklore anthologies, and in whispered warnings told to children around campfires. The words attributed to her, "You cannot silence what is already written," echo like scripture, both a threat and a truth. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part of her legacy, the sense that history itself is less a record of what has been, and more a pattern that continues to unfold, written long before we are born. So the fortune teller endures, not in flesh, not in ashes, but in memory. She waits in the pauses of wind, in the silence between heartbeat and breath. And when people look back upon her story, they are forced to confront a chilling possibility that some fates are not chosen, not escaped but inherited, passed down like shadows in the blood. In this way, Celeste's legend remains eternal, not because of what she did or did not do, but because of what she represents. A mirror held to our deepest fears, a voice whispering from the past that perhaps the future has already been decided. And as the woods grow dark and the night presses close, one cannot help but wonder if, even now, she is still watching and still waiting.